Imagine this, you're standing in a peaceful valley. A light breeze is moving through the air, everything around you feels so calm it's like time itself has slowed down. In front of you stands a massive medieval castle. Tall walls, strong towers, and a moat separating it from the rest of the world. At first glance, this place instantly tells a story of a powerful kingdom. Your mind starts painting pictures. Soldiers standing ready at their posts, banners waving in the wind, and guards at the gate watching everyone who comes and goes. You slowly start walking toward the castle, and with every step, its presence feels even more powerful. This doesn't feel like an ordinary structure. It feels like a place where wars were fought, where rulers once made decisions that shaped everything. Every tower, every wall seems to say one thing: power lived here. You start imagining arrows flying through the sky, gates being shut tight, people rushing inside to survive whatever was happening outside. But then, something strange starts to hit you. The closer you look, the more the story in your head begins to shift. Is this really a fortress? Was it actually built for war? Or does it just look like one? That question slowly starts settling in your mind, and you begin to realize, maybe what you're seeing isn't the full story. Here's the twist. A twist that completely changes the meaning of this entire structure. This castle, which looks so powerful and defensive, was actually never part of any major war. No army ever truly defended it, and no proper siege was ever laid against it. It's shocking because everything about it looks like it was built for battle. The truth is, this is an illusion. A carefully designed idea, a kind of planning where every detail was made to create the impression of power. The towers weren't built to spot enemies from far away, they were built so people would look at them and feel impressed. The walls weren't just for protection, they were a message: important people live here. Now think about it, if this castle wasn't built for war, then what was it really built for? Was it just a home? Or was it a statement? A statement meant to tell the world that whoever lives here is powerful beyond doubt? That question makes this story even more interesting because now we're not just looking at a building, we're trying to understand a mindset. And then comes the most shocking part. There was no king behind this castle. No legendary warrior, no noble knight. It wasn't built by someone who conquered lands with a sword. It wasn't earned through battle or blood. It was created by a man whose name probably doesn't even appear in the usual lists of heroes from that era. This was the work of a businessman. A man who didn't win on the battlefield, but in the marketplace. His weapon wasn't a sword, it was trade. He built his power not through land or war, but through strategy, thinking, and smart deals. And that alone makes this story different, because in the medieval world, thinking like this was rare. Every wall of this castle, every tower, is hiding a story. But not a story of war, a story of ambition. The story of a man who broke the rules of society and rose above them. He decided that if respect wasn't given to him, he would create his own identity. And he did it all using stone, wood, and vision. When you look at the castle again, it doesn't feel the same anymore. It's no longer just a structure. It feels like a message. A silent message saying power doesn't always come from swords. Sometimes it comes from money. Sometimes it comes from influence. And sometimes it comes from what people believe about you. And this is just the beginning. Because so far we've only seen the illusion. Now we need to understand the man who created it. Who was he? How did he build that kind of wealth? And why did he build a castle that wasn't really a castle at all? From here begins another deeper story, a story that helps us understand the power system of medieval England. A story where sheep, trade, and ambition come together to write a completely new chapter of history. And the hero of that chapter isn't a warrior, it's a merchant. When we stop looking at this story just as a building, the real picture slowly starts to show up. This is not just stone and wood, it's a reflection of a mindset. A mindset that was quietly challenging the rules of the medieval world. And from here, we step into a time where the meaning of power itself was changing, and that's where the real secret of this story begins. Back in those days, the world was completely different. Power meant swords, wars, and land. The stronger the warrior you were, the more powerful you were considered. But slowly, something new was rising. Money, trade, business, and commerce. These things were quietly replacing the old system, and most people didn't even fully realize what was happening. This was the turning point where medieval society was going through a major shift. On one side there was the old world, kings and knights ruling everything. On the other side, a new world was forming, where merchants and traders were starting to build their place. This wasn't just an economic change, it was a full transformation of power. And right in the middle of this shift, our story starts to take direction. Because Stokesay Castle isn't just a building, it's a symbol of that silent change happening inside society. It represents the moment when people started realizing that power doesn't only come from land, it can also come from wealth. If you imagine that time, you would see markets getting more active, cities growing in trade, people exchanging goods more often, and different parts of Europe becoming connected and dependent on each other. This growing connection was creating a new system, where merchants were slowly becoming more and more important. In this changing world, some people weren't just surviving, they were actually thriving. These were the ones who understood something powerful. Real power was no longer only in the sword, it was in supply chains and trade routes. These people were quietly building a new elite class that was starting to challenge the old nobility. But this transition wasn't smooth at all. There was tension between the old system and the new one. Nobles still saw themselves as superior, while merchants were slowly rising to stand on equal ground. It was a silent competition, a race where the weapon wasn't a sword, it was wealth. In this same world, people like Lawrence of Ludlow appear. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a product of this new system. He saw where the world was heading and he used that shift to his advantage. That's why his story isn't just personal success. It becomes part of a bigger historical change. To understand this shift, we have to look at how powerful the wool industry was in medieval England. It wasn't just a simple product, it was the backbone of the economy. And the people controlling this trade were slowly becoming more powerful than anyone expected. This new system created a very interesting reality. Power was no longer only inherited. Now, anyone could rise based on their thinking, business skills, and decisions. For that time, this idea was almost revolutionary, and Lawrence became part of that revolution. When we look deeper into this story, we realize Stokesay Castle wasn't just built randomly. It was a statement, a signal that the definition of power had already changed. It was physical proof of an invisible shift happening in society. And from here, the journey gets even more interesting. Because now we're not just looking at a castle, we're understanding the mindset that created it. Every stone, every tower carries a message, that power is no longer only the monopoly of kings. And this is where the story connects to one individual. Lawrence of Ludlow isn't just a name, he becomes a symbol. A symbol that shows if you understand the system, you can find your place in it, no matter if you were born noble or not. At this point, the mystery goes even deeper. Because now the question isn't just how the castle was built. The real question is why a merchant would take such a bold step to turn his identity into stone. And that curiosity leads us into the next part, where we finally explore the real life and mindset of the man behind it all. And from here, a new chapter of the real story begins, where we're not just looking at ideas anymore, but we're starting to understand a person. A man who rises right from the middle of this entire system. Lawrence of Ludlow is no longer just a merchant. He becomes a symbol of rising power. Because the shift we talked about earlier now shows its real face through him. Lawrence didn't come from a royal family. He had no title, no inherited land, and no knight identity. He was just an ordinary guy stepping into the world of markets to build his place. But he had one thing that made him different from everyone else. His sharp business mind and perfect sense of timing. He quickly figured out what real power looked like in medieval England. Instead of swords and battles, he focused on trade and supply chains. While others talked about wars, Lawrence was thinking about deals and profits. And this way of thinking slowly turned him from an ordinary merchant into someone extraordinary. Wool trade became the center of his life. The sheep on England's hills weren't just animals for him, they were a source of wealth. He would collect wool from local farmers, organize it, and then export it to markets across Europe. Every shipment was making him more powerful than before. As his deals grew, his reach also expanded. He didn't stay limited to small local markets. He built his presence in major trade cities like Shrewsbury and London. From there, his influence didn't stay only in business. It started reaching social and even political circles. Slowly, Lawrence reached a level where he was no longer just a businessman. He started shaping economic decisions. His name began appearing around people who were close to the king's advisors. That was a rare position for someone not born into nobility, but he understood the system better than most. The most interesting thing is that his wealth wasn't just about numbers. His wealth was giving him respect and access, things that were normally only for the aristocracy. Now Lawrence was entering spaces where common people could only look from outside, not step in. With this rising power, his mindset also started to change. He wasn't just thinking about survival or business growth anymore. He started thinking about legacy. He wanted his name to live on, not just in records but in stone and structure. And this thinking eventually shaped something like Stokesay Castle. But behind this success there was also a hidden struggle. Medieval society still saw nobility as superior. A merchant rising this high wasn't easy for everyone to accept. Lawrence had to constantly prove his place. That pressure pushed him to become even more ambitious. And that ambition led him to a bold decision, turning his identity into something physical. Making money was not enough anymore. Now he wanted the world to see that he was part of the elite class too. And that mindset pushed him toward building something like Stokesay Castle. When we look at Lawrence at this stage, he doesn't feel like just one person. He feels like the face of a transition. A man standing between the old world and the new world. His story is not just personal success, it's a reflection of a changing world, where the definition of power was being rewritten. And from here, the most important phase of the story begins, where Lawrence of Ludlow is no longer just a successful merchant. He turns into a massive force of extreme wealth. This is the stage where his business is no longer small-scale trading anymore. It has fully transformed into large-scale operations. And this is the point where money stops being just income and becomes real influence. His trade system wasn't simple at all. He wasn't just a guy selling goods in small markets. He was controlling a full bulk supply chain, collecting huge amounts of wool, storing it, and then shipping it across different markets in Europe. This was running like a fully organized empire. Every deal wasn't just bringing profit. It was making his entire network stronger and bigger. With every shipment, his position kept getting more powerful. In a world where normal people could only earn limited income in their lifetime, Lawrence was generating wealth in a single cycle that was bigger than entire communities' yearly earnings. And this gap was pushing him far above a normal merchant level. Now his business wasn't just trade anymore, it had become an economic engine. Local farmers, monasteries, and landowners were all becoming part of his system. He would buy wool from them, gather it, organize it, and then push it into international markets. In this way, he became the central control of the whole supply chain. At this stage, his wealth wasn't just about comfort anymore. It started giving him real negotiation power. He could influence prices, understand demand, and even shape the market direction indirectly. This was the moment where the gap between a merchant and a system changer started disappearing. As his business expanded, his confidence and ambition also grew with it. Now he wasn't just surviving or competing, he was stepping into a position where he could dominate. His name was now being spoken among the strongest players of the medieval economy. The biggest impact of this wealth was that Lawrence was moving from invisible power to visible power. Earlier, he was only important in markets. But now, even elite social circles were starting to open their doors to him. And that was rare because in that time, changing social class was not easy at all. But Lawrence started breaking that system. He proved that power doesn't only come from birth, it can also come from strategy and timing. And in that era, this idea was almost revolutionary. He himself became a living example of that revolution. Now his wealth wasn't just numbers anymore, it became a tool of identity. He wasn't just collecting money, he was turning it into a message. A message that told society he was not just a merchant. He was a serious contender for the elite class. And in the middle of this extreme wealth and rising influence, a new idea is born. The idea of permanent identity. This is the turning point where Lawrence stops being just a business name and starts moving toward creating a physical symbol to secure his place in history. And from here, the real purpose of Stokesay Castle becomes even clearer. And from here, the story gets even more intense, because Lawrence of Ludlow is no longer just a successful trader. He has become a force that is quietly controlling the flow of the medieval economy. This is the stage where his business moves far beyond small deals and enters a massive scale, and this is where his real power starts to make sense. His business model was not simple at all. This wasn't just a shop or a local trading setup, it was a structured network working on multiple levels. Wool collection, sorting, storage, and export, everything was connected like a chain. At every step, value was being added, and every layer was making Lawrence stronger and more powerful. If you look at the medieval economy, scale was very limited back then. But Lawrence broke that limit. He stopped thinking small and started focusing on bulk trade. That mindset pushed him into a different category, where he wasn't just part of the system anymore, he was starting to control it. Every shipment leaving England for Europe wasn't just goods moving, it was wealth moving. And Lawrence became the central point of that movement. He became the middle link that controlled supply and also influenced demand. In that world, this position was extremely rare. As his network kept growing, his authority also kept rising. Local producers started depending on him. Monasteries and landowners also sold their wool through his system. Slowly, he was building an invisible empire, one that wasn't officially named, but it was real in every way. The most interesting part was this: Lawrence could now indirectly influence prices. He studied the market, understood timing, and made smart deals based on that. This didn't make him just a merchant, it made him a strategist. He wasn't reacting to the market, he was predicting it. His wealth was no longer just money sitting there. It had become a tool. A tool that gave him power in negotiations, influence in decisions, and access to places that were only for the elite. This is where money stops being survival and becomes transformation. As his financial strength grew, his confidence also reached another level. He didn't look like just a businessman anymore. He looked like someone who understood the system and was quietly rising inside it. This change didn't happen overnight, but once it started, it couldn't be reversed. This wealth also opened another door: social acceptance. He was no longer limited to markets. His presence started reaching elite circles. And in medieval society, this kind of shift was rare because class systems were very strict. But Lawrence was pushing through those boundaries. And in the middle of all this extreme wealth and influence, one final realization was born: making money alone is not enough. Now he needed to lock his identity permanently. He needed to make his power visible. And this idea eventually transformed Stokesay Castle from a simple manor into a symbol, where every stone says one thing: Lawrence is not just a merchant, he is a force that shapes the system. And when Lawrence of Ludlow's influence starts reaching beyond England, and his mindset begins crossing borders, that's when a whole new powerful phase of the story begins: international expansion. Now he's no longer just a local merchant. He has become a trader connected directly with Europe's major economic centers. His business was no longer limited to Shropshire or even England. The wool collected from English fields was now going straight into Europe's biggest fashion and textile hubs. Places like Bruges, Ghent, and Flanders became the core of his trade network. At this point, Lawrence wasn't just a supplier anymore, he became an international link. This wasn't random growth, it was calculated expansion. Lawrence understood something very clearly: real power comes when you don't just sell products, you connect every important node of the supply chain. He started using every city like a part of a network, where one deal would unlock the next one. The most important part of this international trade was that Lawrence himself had to travel. He wasn't just sitting in an office making decisions, he was actually going into European markets. He met buyers face to face, negotiated prices, and built long-term agreements. That personal involvement made his business even stronger. Every trip wasn't just travel, it was a learning experience. He studied different markets, watched fashion trends, and adjusted his supply based on demand. This adaptability made him one of the few medieval merchants who actually thought globally. When he entered European trading cities, he wasn't seen as just a seller. He was seen as a powerful supplier who controlled consistent, high-quality wool. That reputation gave him serious bargaining power, making every deal more profitable than the last. At this stage, Lawrence's network worked like an invisible web. Farmers in England produced wool, local agents collected it, and Lawrence moved it across Europe. Every link depended on the other, and that dependency made him the center of the entire system. As his reach kept growing, his reliability became his biggest asset. Buyers across Europe knew that if Lawrence was supplying, both quality and quantity would be stable. In medieval trade, trust like this was extremely rare, and it pushed him into the elite trader category. Now his identity was no longer just a merchant. He had become an international businessman, someone moving value across borders. This transformation didn't just make him rich, it made him globally relevant. And in the middle of this international success, another idea started growing inside him. If his value had become this powerful, then his physical presence should be just as powerful too. His next step was no longer just business expansion, it was legacy creation. And that thinking pushed him toward building Stokesay Castle as a symbol, a stone-made signature of international success. When Lawrence of Ludlow's name is no longer limited to markets and trade, the story shifts into a much more powerful direction, where he is not just a businessman anymore, but someone getting closer to decision-making circles. This is the stage where influence is no longer just about wealth, it starts touching real power structures. In medieval England, the king wasn't just a ruler, he was also the central authority of the economy. And when someone understood the economic system deeply enough to affect it, they naturally moved closer to power. Lawrence had now entered this dangerous and powerful zone. His expertise was no longer just about wool trade. He started understanding how the kingdom's economy actually worked, what goods mattered, how revenue was generated, and what kept the system running. This knowledge brought him closer to the same level as people who shape policy and taxation. Slowly, Lawrence was no longer just a player in the market. He was being seen as an advisor to the system. He started becoming part of discussions where real economic decisions were made. In medieval society, this was extremely rare, especially for a merchant. The biggest shift here was that Lawrence was no longer reacting to the system, he was starting to influence it. When someone starts impacting taxation and trade rules, they are no longer just wealthy, they become part of the power structure itself. His input on taxation was especially important. Taxes weren't just about money, they were a symbol of control and authority. And when Lawrence got close to these decisions, it meant money had officially entered politics. The most interesting part is that this influence wasn't loud or public. It was silent power, inside discussions, behind decisions, through advisory roles. Lawrence wasn't openly a ruler, but he was quietly shaping the system that ruled others. As his influence kept growing, one thing became very clear to him. Just making money is not enough. Real power comes when wealth turns into authority. And Lawrence was standing right in the middle of that transformation. At this stage, he didn't feel like just a merchant or investor anymore. He became a hybrid figure, a bridge between business and governance. This is where the traditional boundaries of medieval society start to blur. And from here, the next step in his story becomes obvious. When someone reaches the economic level of kings, just showing wealth is not enough anymore. They need something permanent, a physical symbol that declares their status. And this is the mindset that pushes Lawrence in a bold direction. Now he doesn't just want influence, he wants it to last forever. And that ambition makes Stokesay Castle even more meaningful. Not just a house, but an architectural statement of power. When Lawrence took control of Stokesay, the story enters a much deeper psychological layer, and here a very important question comes up. Why does a merchant even need a castle? This wasn't just an architecture decision, it was an identity question. In medieval society, respect didn't come from money. It was inherited through bloodlines, titles, and centuries of nobility. No matter how rich a businessman became, he was still seen as an outsider. And that was the invisible wall Lawrence wanted to break. And here a simple truth appears. Respect can't be directly bought, but its image can be created. When a person can't change their reality, they change how that reality looks. And Stokesay Castle becomes the physical form of that idea. A castle wasn't just stone and wood. It was a language, a visual language that sends a message without speaking. When someone saw it from far away, they didn't just see a house, they saw a symbol of power. And that symbolism is what makes it extraordinary. Lawrence's goal was never simple. He didn't just want a comfortable life. He wanted people to look at him and place him as close as possible to nobility. And in the medieval world, perception mattered a lot, sometimes even more than reality. The castle itself was a psychological strategy. When you build something that looks strong, defensive, and royal, society automatically starts placing you in that category. It was silent manipulation, turning status into architecture. That's why Stokesay cannot just be called a home. It was a statement that said, I am not just a merchant. I am part of the world that defines power. A message written in stone without a single word. And when you look deeper, you realize this wasn't just ego. It was also survival. In medieval hierarchy, wealth alone wasn't enough. You had to make that wealth visible to be accepted. Now Lawrence's mindset becomes very clear. He is no longer just expanding business. He is rebuilding his identity. And Stokesay becomes the first physical proof of that reconstruction. A symbol that transforms him from an invisible merchant into a visible figure of power. This is the moment where the tone of the story changes. Now we are not just looking at a building, we are watching ambition take shape. And this ambition is what slowly turns a castle from an illusion into a reality. And from here, the story enters another interesting and symbolic layer, where Lawrence of Ludlow is no longer just upgrading his wealth or land. He is now officially upgrading his position with society's approval. This is the stage where power is not only real, it becomes legally recognized. And in medieval England, the strongest symbol of this recognition was something called the license to crenellate. This license wasn't just a paper. It was like a medieval badge of honor. When the king allowed someone to add battlements and castle-like features to their home, it meant that person was now considered important. It was an official signal that you were no longer just an ordinary citizen. You were getting close to elite status. For Lawrence, this moment was not just about architecture. It was proof of social transformation. Now he wasn't only building identity through wealth, he was strengthening his legitimacy through the approval of the state. In medieval times, this was extremely rare, especially for a merchant. The most important part of this license was that it legally reinforced perception. When people saw a house with crenellations, they automatically started seeing the owner as powerful and respected. It was both a visual and legal upgrade at the same time. Now Stokesay was no longer just a manor house. It was slowly turning into a symbolic fortress. Every battlement, every tower was sending one message. This person is not just rich, he is officially important. And that difference mattered a lot in medieval hierarchy. For Lawrence, this approval was also a psychological victory. Because now his identity was not only based on personal success, it was backed by the king's endorsement. That gave him the confidence to push his social boundaries even further. This license was like a medieval verified badge, similar to a verified account in today's digital world. It meant you are credible, important, and accepted by the system. And Lawrence was using that validation to his advantage. Now his property was no longer just functional, it had become expressive. Every structure was making a statement. Every wall and tower was saying that this person is not hiding his identity, he is displaying it proudly. At this stage, another truth becomes clear. Power is not only acquired, it is also perceived. If society sees you as powerful, your real influence automatically grows. And Lawrence was mastering this perception game. After this license, Stokesay's transformation became even more intentional. It was no longer just a residence, it became a designed image. An image that permanently locked Lawrence's ambition into the physical world. This is where we understand that Lawrence's vision was never limited to business. He was turning his life into a legacy. And the foundation of that legacy was this official recognition that brought him closer to the elite circle. The license also gave him something else. Confidence to compete with nobility. Now he wasn't just a merchant looking at elites from outside. He was someone adopting their symbols. That psychological shift became a major turning point in his story. And from here, Stokesay's design becomes even more meaningful. Every architectural decision is no longer just about beauty or comfort. It becomes a status signal. The building slowly turns into a silent language that explains Lawrence's position to the world. This license wasn't just permission, it was validation. And Lawrence used that validation to push his identity to the next level. Now he was on his way to becoming not just a wealthy merchant, but an officially recognized elite figure. At this stage, the story reveals a deeper truth. Medieval power was controlled not just by swords but also by symbols. And Lawrence understood those symbols perfectly. That understanding is what turned him from ordinary to extraordinary. Stokesay was now slowly transforming from a simple estate into a symbolic castle. Every stone, every structure was saying that Lawrence was no longer on the edge of the system. He was moving closer to its center. And when we look at this transformation, we realize this was not just construction. It was an identity redesign project. A project that was silently challenging the rigid rules of medieval society. And this is where the story moves toward its climax. Now the question is not just what Lawrence built, but what he built himself into. And Stokesay becomes the final visible proof of that transformation. And when we move past the Great Hall and start exploring the rest of Stokesay, something else becomes very clear: detail. This building wasn't just an idea, it was an attempt to take that idea to perfection. In every small detail you can see planning, design, and craftsmanship. Nothing here was left random. From the woodwork to the roof, from the stairs to the structural joints, every single element was carefully designed. This wasn't just construction, it was an art form where function and beauty were perfectly balanced. When you look at the wooden structures, you realize that this level of finishing was not normal for that time. The carpenters didn't just do the job, they showed their skill. Every beam, every joint feels like a silent signature, proving that expert craftsmanship was used here. The roof design itself was a masterpiece. The high ceiling, combined with the wooden framework, wasn't just for support, it was also for visual impact. When someone looked up, they would see a structured pattern that made the whole space feel even more grand. The stairs were also something special. These weren't just simple steps, they were solid, strong, and beautifully shaped. In some places, entire tree trunks were carved into stairs, showing a mix of raw strength and fine craftsmanship. All of this detail proves one thing: the builder wasn't just creating a structure, he was creating an experience. He wanted people to not just see the building but feel it. And that feeling comes from the details. Another important part of this craftsmanship is that it quietly shows wealth. When you use high-quality materials and skilled labor like this, you are showing your financial strength without saying a word. It's a kind of silent luxury, subtle but impossible to miss. Lawrence clearly understood that real impression comes from small details. Big halls and towers alone are not enough unless the inside details are just as strong. That's why he focused on every element, so the entire building delivers one consistent message. It's also clear that he had a strong sense of aesthetics. He wasn't just thinking about function, he cared about visual harmony and balance. That's why Stokesay feels less like a structure, and more like a carefully designed composition. This level of finishing was luxury for that time. And Lawrence used that luxury on purpose, to make his position even stronger. The craftsmanship itself became an extension of his status. When someone looks at this building closely, they can see effort everywhere. And that effort is what sets it apart from others. It's not just strong, it's refined. And that combination is what makes it unique. At this point, it becomes very clear that every part of Stokesay is a planned message. Nothing is accidental. Every detail serves a purpose, and that purpose is impression, status, and identity. And through this craftsmanship, Lawrence wrote his story into stone and wood. This is no longer just a house, it's a legacy. A legacy that still reflects his mindset and ambition even today. And when we go even deeper into Stokesay's architecture, another powerful element shows up: the South Tower. This tower isn't just part of the structure. It's the clearest expression of Lawrence's mindset and ambition. This is where he's not just following design, he's creating a message. The design of the South Tower was straight up inspired by royal castles. Its shape, its structure, and its positioning, all of it was built to remind people of king-level fortresses. This wasn't random, it was a very deliberate move. In the medieval world, architecture wasn't just about building something, it was a reflection of identity. And when someone designs their building in a royal style, it's not just about looks, it's about leveling up their status. That's exactly what Lawrence was doing. Every angle of this tower sends a silent message. From a distance, it looks like a strong defensive structure, just like the castles owned by kings. And that visual similarity? That was his main weapon. People believed what they saw. But when you really think about it, this wasn't just copying, it was calculated ambition. Lawrence wasn't trying to become someone else. He was placing himself at the same level where kings and nobles stood. The entrance of the tower is also interesting. Slightly elevated, a bit dramatic, it makes the whole thing feel more powerful and imposing. And again, this wasn't just for defense, it was for impact. Another key feature of the tower is the view. From the top, you can clearly see the surrounding land. That's not just strategic, it's symbolic. It sends a message that Lawrence isn't just inside his space, he's watching over his world. Through this imitation, Lawrence made a risky but smart move. He connected his identity to a level he didn't officially belong to. But through architecture, he built a bridge to that level. And here's the thing, visual signals were extremely powerful in medieval society. If your home looks like a king's castle, people start treating you with that same level of respect. Lawrence understood this psychology perfectly. The South Tower was basically a declaration without saying a word. It was saying, I'm not just a merchant. I'm operating at the level where power is defined. That message wasn't written anywhere, but every stone reflected it. At this point, it becomes obvious that Stokes's design wasn't random at all. Every part was part of a strategy. And the South Tower was the boldest move in that strategy, where imitation and ambition came together. Through this tower, Lawrence didn't just build a structure, he built an illusion. An illusion that didn't change reality, but completely transformed perception. And through that transformation, he kept upgrading his position silently. This tower became both a symbol of his success and a signal of where he was headed next. And from here, the story gets even more interesting, because now we start seeing how every part of Stokesay is filled with hidden messages, and how the entire building becomes a carefully crafted identity. And when we move past Stokesay's grand halls and those powerful towers, we step into a completely different kind of space, the solar. And the vibe here? Totally different. No show-off, no power display, just peace, privacy, and a real glimpse of personal life. The solar was basically Lawrence and his family's private living space. This was the spot where he stepped away from his public image and just lived his real life. No guests, no pressure to impress. Just comfort, quiet, and a sense of home. The design of this room reflects that perfectly. Unlike the Great Hall, which is big and open, this space feels controlled, cozy, and personal. The windows are placed in a way that lets light in but still keeps things private. It's all about balance, living first, not showing off. In most medieval castles, comfort wasn't really a priority. It was all about defense and survival. But the solar at Stokesay clearly breaks that pattern. This wasn't just a castle, it was a place where someone could actually live peacefully. Here, Lawrence isn't a businessman or a power player. He's just a human being, a husband, a father. This space was his escape from a world where he constantly had to prove himself. Here he could just be himself. The existence of the solar is strong proof that Stokesay was never just a fortress. If it was purely built for defense, spaces like this wouldn't be designed with so much care and comfort. This clearly shows a home-first mindset. The elements used for comfort here, better insulation, controlled space, thoughtful interior design, were considered luxury back then. And that luxury wasn't just about money, it was about lifestyle. Lawrence wasn't just trying to impress people, he was improving his life. And this creates another powerful contrast. From the outside, Stokesay looks like a strong fortress, but inside it feels like a peaceful home. That dual identity is what makes it so unique. It's both an illusion and a reality at the same time. The solar is a reminder that Lawrence's goal wasn't just to impress society. He also wanted a better personal life. This space was his reward, his hard work, his success, his journey, all coming together in one place. When you look at it in the bigger story, you realize something deeper. Stokesay isn't just a symbol of ambition, it's a symbol of balance. On one side, power and image, on the other, comfort and real life. And somehow, Lawrence managed to combine both perfectly. This private space shows that inside every powerful structure, there's also a simple human story. A quiet story far from the noise. And the solar is the most beautiful part of that silent story. At this point, it becomes crystal clear. This building can't just be called a castle. Castles are built for survival, but Stokesay was designed for living. And that difference is exactly what makes it one of the most unique structures of its time. And with this realization, the story becomes even more meaningful. Because now we understand, it's not just an illusion, it's a carefully balanced reality. A world designed by one man on his own terms. And now we arrive at one of the strangest, and honestly one of the most beautiful parts of Stokesay, the gatehouse. At first glance, it looks like a classic, impressive entrance. The kind you'd expect to be the defensive front of a real castle. But the moment you start looking closer, a surprising truth starts to show up. This is actually the most fancy part of Stokesay. The design is so attractive, it almost feels like a piece of art. The timber framing, the patterns, the carvings, everything is crafted in a way that looks beautiful from every angle. This isn't just an entrance, it's visually stunning. But here's where the paradox kicks in. In a normal castle, the gatehouse is the strongest, most defensive part. But here, it's the complete opposite. It looks strong, but in reality it's almost useless for defense. No serious fortification, no real protection, just appearance. The carvings on this gatehouse, angels, patterns, decorative shapes, they clearly show one thing. This wasn't built for war, it was built for beauty. These kinds of details don't belong in military structures, but here they are the main focus. And that tells you something important. Lawrence, or even the later owners, never really cared about pure defense. They were building something to impress people, attract attention, and leave a strong visual impact. The gatehouse works like an introduction. Before you even step inside, it makes a statement. When someone sees it, they instantly feel like they're entering somewhere special. That's a psychological effect, and it hits immediately. Even the structure itself says a lot. Lighter materials, more open design, and a strong focus on decoration. It's the opposite of heavy stone defense. This entrance doesn't intimidate, it invites. If you look at it deeper, this gatehouse is basically the summary of the entire Stokesay philosophy. Strong illusion on the outside, soft reality on the inside. It's a beautiful lie, where appearance and purpose are completely different. It looks like armies would march through here, but in reality it was guests who walked in. That contrast is what makes it so unique. This isn't the gate to a battlefield, it's the entrance to a social world. The beauty of the gatehouse also highlights something else. Well, when you can afford this level of detailed carvings and design, you're silently showing your financial power. It's quiet luxury, but it speaks loud. And here's the most interesting part. This structure is completely unnecessary if you're preparing for war. But if your goal is to create impression, it's perfect. And in Lawrence's story, impression is everything. At this point, it becomes clear again. Stokesay was never a traditional castle. It was a carefully designed illusion, where every element was built to shape perception, not provide protection. The gatehouse is like an art piece, a piece that still holds its beauty and uniqueness over time. It's not just an entry point, it's a message. A message that says, here appearance matters just as much, if not more, than reality. And through this beautiful lie, Stokesay completes its story, a story where power isn't just about strength, it's about presentation. And from here, Stokesay's story takes a completely different turn, where illusion, status, and design finally face a reality check. For years, this place existed like a peaceful manor. Life went on, families lived here, and everything gave off a sense of stability. But history never stays still. No matter how long peace lasts, there always comes a moment when the system starts shaking. And in England, that moment arrived. The Civil War storm began to rise. This was the point where not just structures, but their real meaning was going to be tested. Stokesay, which had always been a mix of symbolic fortress and luxury home, suddenly found itself in an unpredictable situation. What was once built for show was now being judged through survival. And this is where the gap between illusion and reality starts becoming clear. War is not just a political event, it reveals the true value of everything. Things built only for impression often break under pressure. But things built for real defense are the ones that survive. For Stokesy, this was a reality check moment. For years, its gatehouse and walls were symbols of beauty and status. Now they were being looked at in a completely different way. Could this actually survive a war or not? The environment of the Civil War was brutal and unpredictable. Armies were moving, territories were shifting, and the future of every stronghold was uncertain. Stokesy was no longer just a peaceful estate, it had become a potential target. At this point, Lawrence's vision becomes even more obvious in contrast. What was designed for impression now looks weak in a survival situation. This is the moment where the difference between design and reality becomes crystal clear. People now realize for the first time that this structure was never truly built for war. It wasn't a battlefield fortress. It was a lifestyle statement, a symbol of status. And the Civil War exposed that truth. Before the war, everything felt controlled. But now uncertainty takes over. Every wall, every tower is being reevaluated. Can it defend or not? That question starts challenging Stokesy's identity itself. This is the turning point where the tone of the story changes. Now we're not just talking about architecture or ambition. We're seeing the clash between illusion and reality. And the Civil War triggers that clash. Stokesy becomes a testing ground, where decades of design and planning face a single reality check. And from here, the next chapter begins, where we finally see how much of this illusion can survive when war becomes real. And then that moment comes, where Stokesy's whole story faces its biggest test, reality. During the Civil War, tension is at its peak. Armies move into the area, and it feels like a full siege or real castle defense is about to happen. But what actually happens is completely the opposite. There's an attack, but no real fight. No heroic stand. No long battle. No dramatic castle defense like you'd expect in movies. Everything ends way too fast. And the reason is simple, but kinda brutal. The truth is, Stokesy was never built for war. It wasn't designed as a battlefield fortress. It wasn't a real military stronghold. It was a symbol, a lifestyle statement, a status display. Basically a carefully built illusion. When real danger shows up, that illusion hits its limit. Anything built just for looks and impression can't survive real pressure. And Stokesy proves exactly that. So there's no real resistance. People quickly realize fighting here is pointless, because the structure itself isn't made for defense. And in that moment, everything changes. Stokesy's real identity gets exposed. What looked like a strong fortress from far away turns out to be just an aesthetic manor. Towers, walls, gatehouse. Everything was more about appearance than real protection. And that's where the illusion breaks. The image of strength, defense, and war readiness just disappears in front of reality. And the truth is simple, what you see isn't always what's real. The war doesn't just test the building, it exposes the mindset behind it. It shows that Lawrence's vision was impressive, but not built for real warfare. And that gap becomes its biggest weakness. But here's the interesting part, Stokesy doesn't fail. It doesn't get destroyed. It survives because it was never meant for war in the first place. Its purpose was image, identity, and impression. And in that, it succeeded. And that's when the real question hits. If this wasn't a fortress, then what was it really? And then that moment comes, where Stokesy's whole story faces its biggest test, reality. During the Civil War, tension is at its peak. Armies move into the area, and it feels like a full siege or real castle defense is about to happen. But what actually happens is completely the opposite. There's an attack, but no real fight. No heroic stand. No long battle. No dramatic castle defense like you'd expect in movies. Everything ends way too fast. And the reason is simple, but kinda brutal. The truth is, Stokesy was never built for war. It wasn't designed as a battlefield fortress. It wasn't a real military stronghold. It was a symbol, a lifestyle statement, a status display. Basically a carefully built illusion. When real danger shows up, that illusion hits its limit. Anything built just for looks and impression can't survive real pressure. And Stokesy proves exactly that. So there's no real resistance. People quickly realize fighting here is pointless, because the structure itself isn't made for defense. And in that moment, everything changes. Stokesy's real identity gets exposed. What looked like a strong fortress from far away turns out to be just an aesthetic manor. Towers, walls, gatehouse. Everything was more about appearance than real protection. And that's where the illusion breaks. The image of strength, defense, and war readiness just disappears in front of reality. And the truth is simple: what you see isn't always what's real. The war doesn't just test the building, it exposes the mindset behind it. It shows that Lawrence's vision was impressive, but not built for real warfare. And that gap becomes its biggest weakness. But here's the interesting part: Stokesy doesn't fail. It doesn't get destroyed. It survives because it was never meant for war in the first place. Its purpose was image, identity, and impression. And in that, it succeeded. And that's when the real question hits. If this wasn't a fortress, then what was it really? After the war, the scene that unfolds becomes one of the most ironic and meaningful parts of Stokesy's story. Once the dust of the Civil War settles, it's clear the whole structure wasn't wiped out. Some parts got damaged, a few walls were torn down, but the main core buildings are still standing. The outer defenses were slighted, basically deliberately weakened so they couldn't be used for military purposes again. But here's the interesting part: the central structure of Stokesy survives. The Great Hall, the solar, and the main living areas all remain intact. And the reason is pretty simple: it wasn't seen as a real threat. This wasn't a hardcore military fortress. It wasn't the kind of place you'd go all out to destroy. It was more of a manor house, a place built more for status and identity than for real warfare. That's where the irony really hits. Something that looked like a castle all along actually wasn't built to function like one in real war conditions. And because of that, nobody felt the need to fully tear it down. The fact that the main building survived shows its real purpose wasn't defensive. If it had been a proper stronghold, its fate would have been very different. But since it was low risk, it was basically left alone. This aftermath adds another layer to Stokesy. It becomes a symbol of survival. Even after damage, it doesn't fully collapse. It turns into a monument that survives because of its own weakness. That contradiction is exactly what makes it unique. Over time, the damaged parts just become part of history. What remains turns into a living piece of the past, a reminder of an era when appearances and reality didn't always match. At this point, another truth comes out. Sometimes non-threatening things survive longer simply because there's no strategic reason to destroy them. Stokesy fits that logic perfectly. The walls that were torn down exposed the illusion of a castle. But what stayed standing was the real identity of the place. It was always more peaceful, more residential. So its survival actually makes perfect sense. Instead of just destruction, Stokesy ends up becoming a story of transformation. It's no longer just a broken fortress, it's a surviving story. A place that still exists because of, not despite, its fragility. And through that survival, it gains a deeper meaning. It's not just a castle or manor anymore, it becomes a historical lesson. Not everything that looks powerful is actually built for war. From here, the story moves into its final reflection. Stokesy's real legacy isn't strength, it's survival and symbolism. And this is where the full story of Stokesy Castle reaches its final meaning. It's no longer just the story of a building, it becomes the story of a society in transition. A shift where the old world slowly gives way to something completely new. In the old system, power was simple: kings, warriors, and bloodlines. Whoever had the sword, the land, and a noble name, that was who held real authority. Strength meant physical dominance and inherited status. But stories like Stokesy quietly reveal a different kind of revolution. A new form of power starts to rise: trade, commerce, and money. Influence is no longer decided only on the battlefield. Now it also depends on markets, supply chains, and economic control. Lawrence of Ludlow becomes a perfect example of that shift. He wasn't a king or a warrior, but he still had enough influence to reshape his identity. He didn't just collect wealth, He turned it into status, land, and architecture. And what he really proved is that money isn't just about comfort, it's a tool of power. When wealth becomes visible and structured, it can shape how society sees you. And in many cases, perception itself becomes real power. Stokesay Castle becomes the physical symbol of that transformation. From the outside it still looks like a fortress, but inside it reflects the ambition and strategy of a merchant. It stands right at the bridge between the old world and the new one. The most important lesson here is simple. Power is never static. It evolves. Once it lived in swords, then in land, and eventually it shifted into money and trade. Stokesay is just a silent witness to that transition. Lawrence didn't directly change his era, but he definitely represented the change. He showed that even a businessman could reach a level once reserved only for kings. And for that time, that idea alone was revolutionary. If you only see Stokesay as a building, you miss its depth. It's actually a message, a reminder that society never stays the same. Every generation redefines what power really means. And that's why Stokesay Castle still matters today. It's not just medieval architecture, it's a symbol of social evolution. A symbol that shows power doesn't only come from the sword, it also comes from strategy and wealth. The final truth is this: Lawrence didn't just build a castle, he built an idea. And that idea was that the world was changing, and new rules were being written. And when you look back, you realize Stokesay's greatest legacy isn't its walls, it's its message. And when we finally look at the whole story together, one simple but powerful truth stands out. A man with no royal blood, no inherited title, and no traditional noble background still managed to build his own legacy from scratch. Lawrence of Ludlow proved that identity isn't defined by birth. What makes someone memorable are their decisions, their vision, and how they execute it. He didn't just store wealth, he shaped it, turning it into stone, timber, and architecture. Stokesay Castle is the physical result of that mindset. Every tower, every hall, every detail reflects the thinking of a man who wanted to redefine his place in society. He didn't write his identity in words, he wrote it in structure. This castle isn't just a building, it's a message that still echoes centuries later. A message that isn't limited to medieval England, but applies to every era. And Lawrence lived that truth. He entered a system where the rules were already set, but he still found a way to carve out his place within it. His story reminds us that legacy doesn't belong only to kings and warriors. Sometimes, a businessman can build something so strong that it survives for centuries, not just because of wealth, but because of vision. Stokesay still stands today not just because it was strong, but because it was built on an idea stronger than time itself. And that idea is simple: power is never fixed, it keeps shifting. And when we look at it today, it doesn't just feel like history, it feels like a reminder that the world belongs to those who understand change and move with it. That's the final lesson of this story, and the true legacy of Stokesay. If you're into hidden stories like this, real-life history that feels more interesting than fiction, then don't stop the video here. Stories like this don't just teach us history, they show us how the whole power system of the world keeps changing, and how ordinary people end up building extraordinary legacies. Backhand index pointing right, drop a comment and tell me, what historic place do you find the most unique? And if you want more hidden stories like this, the kind you won't find deep in textbooks but are way more interesting in real life, make sure you follow the channel, because the next story might just shock you even more.